I say? They'll even sign them for you. We are thrilled to be hosting the 6th year of Jewish food around the world at the museum, generously supported by the Feingold family in memory of Marilyn Feingold, a longtime gallery educator here at the museum. Before we get started on the panel, please join me, in welcoming Dr. Feingold to the stage.
Thank you very much. I'm trying not to get too emotional. But as many of you know, this event was sponsored in memory of my wife. And it was her idea, but she was very ill, to create such an event for the museum. So I want to tell you a little bit about her. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes. She was born in Brooklyn, grew up on Eastern Parkway, where many of you are familiar with. Graduated Brooklyn College with a master's degree in education. After having 5 children, she decided to return to school. She received a doctorate from Boston University in educational leadership and curriculum development, and was working directly with Elie Wiesel on her committees. One of her passions, in addition to her children and 12 grandchildren now, was to collect menus. She felt that menus invoked memories of gatherings and of times shared with friends and family. She loved New York. She loved the excitement of New York. She admired the rich multicultural heritage of the citizens and the restaurants. In fact, she wrote that, quote, crossing a restaurant's threshold can be compared to getting lost in a good book, as Jayne would say. She saw the varied restaurants and foods as whisking us away to a unique time and place, with the menu setting the tone for the journey. She wrote about New York City pushing culinary and artistic boundaries. She was honored to be a guest speaker for the opening of the new culinary library at Johnson & Wales University in Rhode Island. And at that time when she spoke, she explained her feelings that through menus, we introduce special ideas into our homes, our restaurants, and our institutions. She saw menus as the first interface between the host or hostess and the patron and the chef. When she became very ill, she was concerned about her menus. What happened to them? The entire collection, now way over 1,000, is housed at the library of Johnson & Wales University in the Culinary Institute. It's all online, digitized, so people can study them. And in fact, other groups have brought their menus into the collection because of Marilyn's large collection initiating the whole program. She loved being a docent here. She felt that the museum and the people here created a second family for her. She asked us to develop a program to promote a discussion of Jewish tradition and food. In her words, in fact, she said a menu event should be established. And this is, I think, the 5th event that we've sponsored. This is the 6th. It's on my which is good. Someone once said, when it comes to cultural ethnicity, everything revolves around food. Food can keep memories alive. Memories of our ancestors and our hopes for the future. And again, I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I know for sure by experience this is going to be a wonderful program.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you very much, Len, and the entire Feingold family for, again, giving us the opportunity to explore a fascinating Jewish food story with you. Our culinary journey today begins in the American South, an area well known for its mouth-watering cuisine, buttermilk biscuits and barbecue, gumbo and shrimp with grits, fried chicken and fresh peach ice cream. Now, some Jews who settled south of the Mason-Dixon line continued to eat much as they had in Shmoyetz or Salonika, but others embraced and adapted the new foods they found there, repeating a story as old as the diaspora. Those who daven with a drawl might add Coca-Cola to a Rosh Hashanah honey cake, stir pecans and a shot of Jack Daniels into their haroset, and on a warm October evening, sit under a sukkah hung with pomegranates and sugarcane. In exploring these different foodways, we taste what it means to be Jewish in the South, a tiny minority in the predominantly Protestant Bible Belt. To be Southern, with a deeply rooted sense of place, a strong attachment to the region, and to be Jewish at the same time. Did living in the Bible Belt help preserve their Jewish identity, despite the difficulties and often the rejection of keeping kosher? What role did African Americans play in creating that complex Southern Jewish identity? And do Southerners in urban areas like Memphis and Atlanta express their Jewishness in different ways than Jews in small communities in rural areas? Before we turn to our panel, a brief history lesson. The first Jews in the South arrived in Charleston and Savannah at the end of the 17th century. And by 1800, there were more Jews in Charleston, which was not only the largest but the wealthiest of the cities in the U.S. North or south, including New York, and in fact, Charleston was the first place where a Jew was elected to public office, and that was in 1774. Many of the early Jews who immigrated to the antebellum South were Ashkenazi from Germany and France, mostly from Alsace-Lorraine, many of whom were not traditionally religious. Others came from England, the Caribbean, and the other colonies where they had escaped the Inquisition. They were Sephardic. During the Civil War, some Jews fled north, but most remained loyal to the South, and many fought for the Confederacy. Families divided between North and South faced off against each other. But when it was impossible to get matzah for Passover, congregations in New York and Philadelphia sent 5,000 pounds of unleavened bread to Savannah's Jews. But not all Seder stories were so pretty. Some Southern Jews celebrated their own freedom from Egyptian bondage at Seders cooked and served by enslaved people. Or painful to admit, we can't gloss over the fact that there were Jewish slaveholders in the South, as there were in the North, I might add. Starting with Reconstruction, Jews came to the South in increasing numbers. They came from Eastern Europe and Ottoman lands, as well as from the North and Midwestern U.S. Even today, the names of many Southern towns bear eloquent testimony to their legacy. There's Kaplan, Louisiana, probably the most Cajun place on earth. It's named after Abram Kaplan, a poor Polish immigrant who became a rice baron and a pillar of the community there. Levy, Arkansas, named after a dry goods merchant, Morris Levy. And Marks, Mississippi, after Leopold Marks, a trader. A complicated Jewish identity began to evolve in the 20th century New South. There were rare but defining and nightmarish incidents like the Leo Frank lynching in 1915. And if you haven't seen the museum's compelling exhibit, I urge you to do so. Also, there was anti-Semitic violence during the Civil Rights era, the 1958 temple bombing in Atlanta, which was retaliation for the rabbi's pro-integrationist stance. But on the other hand, we also find bizarre moments that treat Jews as insiders in the Moonlight and Magnolias mythology of the Old South. So you have ads in Yiddish urging Jews to buy Aunt Jemima's latkes with the beloved old plantation flavor, replete with a kerchief-wrapped African-American mammy stereotype, serving a stack of hotcakes. Today's South is no stereotype. It's rapidly becoming more urbanized, and with the influx of different minorities, more diverse as well. The Jewish population there is about 1%, roughly nationally it's about 2%. But those numbers are growing. Small Jewish communities in the rural South may be disappearing, but the Jewish populations in the metropolitan areas keeps increasing. They're drawing newcomers from the north as well as from other parts of the country, Israel and Europe. Atlanta, for example, has And these changing demographics are bringing a renaissance of Jewish life to many parts of the South, sometimes ushering in a return to the traditional practices and foodways. Their kitchens are diverse too, from the low-country kitchens of the Atlantic coast to the world-famous cuisine of the Big Easy and Memphis barbecue. Actually, Jews have been celebrating their food at festivals since the end of the Civil War, and they are food lovers all. So now let's join them at table with a special shout out to Marcy Cohen Ferris, whose book Gefilte Gumbo was the inspiration for this panel. And so, Hasia, as you mentioned in your book, Roads Taken, because so many Jews in the South peddled for some period of time, Jewish peddlers actually played a pivotal role in developing these communities, and food was very much a part of their story. Tell us about the encounters and the foods that they got at the tables.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for including me in this fabulous event. So, the period after the Civil War, although it had roots in the period before as well, saw Jews come to the South, particularly Jewish men, as involved in the lowest rung of business, which was peddling. And these were men who had packs on their backs, and they went from home to home, farm to farm, plantation to plantation, selling domestic goods, things particularly for the home. Needles, threads, mirrors, eyeglasses, jewelry, sheets, towels, pillowcases, and various sundry goods. They had a weekly cycle. That is, they would go to the same house every Monday, every Tuesday, every Wednesday, and so on, selling on the installment plan. Now, all of this background is actually kind of necessary for understanding the food encounter, because since the peddler was on the road all week and only came back to whatever was the closest hub of Jewish life on Friday, the Sabbath, to pay his creditor, to replenish his pack of goods, and usually those were always the same person. The person whose home he stayed at was a retailer, was a wholesaler, or a shopkeeper. The peddler slept there for the weekend, paid him up, went back on the road. So during the week, the obvious question is, where would they sleep and what would they eat? So it was typical that these peddlers slept in the homes of their customers. Okay? And they, in fact, worked out their itinerary by having the last customer of the day be, as one of the memoir writers said, the nicest. Okay? And they would, in fact, often have a little piece of paper with words written in Yiddish. Good morning, ma'am. How are you today? May I lodge at your home? So in the memoirs written by both the peddlers themselves or customers or other observers, the issue of food kept coming up. So if the peddler slept in the customer's home, then the customer, who seemed to always be very happy to have this individual come in and engage with them, say, well, would you like to eat here? And what we see in the material and the primary sources were a range of reactions. So sometimes the peddlers would say, as they tell us, they weren't telling us, but as they reported in their documents, I was so tired. I was so miserable. Honestly, I'm going to eat anything that was put in front of me. And so we have lots of stories of them eating ham hocks and collard greens, cooked in pork fat and bacon and ham, all the range of what we would call trays. Indeed, one wonderful story has a peddler sitting down at the table of the family's home, and the family had invited one of the local ministers to join them for dinner. And the minister said, I thought Moses made legislation that the Hebrew people couldn't eat the flesh of swine. And the peddler said, if Moses had lived in this town, he wouldn't have made those laws. Okay. Others, on the other extreme, would say to the customer, thank you, but I cannot eat your food. Which inevitably led to the question on the part of the customer, why not? Okay. Essentially, it's good enough for us. Why shouldn't it be good enough for you? I have a reputation for making great fill in the blank. And so the fellow said, my religion doesn't allow it, which then begged the next obvious, natural, logical question, which is, what religion are you? Because who would have heard of a religion which proscribed what you could eat? Certainly not Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, holiness, and so on. So this became, the food became an opening wedge for these Jewish peddlers, relatively uneducated poor men, to tell their non-Jewish, African-American, or white hosts what was Judaism. Okay. Sometimes the customer would say, well, tell me what you can eat and I'll make that for you. Or the peddler would leave his own pot in the customer's home, and she, because these were women who were engaged in this conversation, would prepare for him what he could eat, or he would prepare his own food. But either way, either if he was at the one extreme of saying, I don't eat anything, and actually I've always wanted to taste these foods, okay, and maybe these rules in fact don't apply any longer, or the other extreme of, I can't eat your food. Either way, a food exchange went on. He, new immigrants, only immigrants peddled, learned what Southerners ate, what Southern white people ate, what Southern African Americans ate. He could learn to distinguish it by class. On the other hand, they learned something about Judaism, okay, and how Judaism makes food not just something to eat to stoke the body, or not something to eat just because it tastes good, but something that was in the sacred zone.
And so food became not only a barrier, but actually a bridge in that intimate, very intimate environment.
Absolutely. I think in some ways when we think about food history generally, food always serves those two purposes. Bridging differences, because people are, I think the scholars of in biology tell us human beings are inherently omnivorous and easily seduced by new tastes, new smells, just looking at something and say, I'd like to try that. So food is a bridge of sharing, but it's also a boundary. Okay? The word compatriot, companion, is somebody whose bread you will eat. And that word pan in the middle of companion. Okay, so someone whose bread you don't eat will never be your companion. So in this case, in this relatively isolated rural region, deeply riven by the black-white divide, Jews were these immigrant men who went in and out of both zones, bridging and setting up their own boundaries.
And I think food continued to be a bridge as many of these peddlers eventually opened stores, general stores and food stores, sometimes known as actually as the Jew store. So that you had the store owners learning about the things that their customers wanted, cornmeal and collards, lard and self-rising flour. And sometimes you had the Jewish women who worked in the stores trading recipes as well. Now, of course, some traditional Jewish families, especially in larger urban Jewish communities, continued to cook basically the way they had for generations. But as a more diverse Southern Jewish cuisine begins to take shape, we see how African Americans profoundly influence its development, sometimes as transmitters of recipes, and actually sometimes as co-creators of the cuisine itself. Michael, could you tell us about that process?
Sure. It's time for the chocolate chosen moment. So, you mentioned Charleston. And I want to disabuse people who don't come from the historic South. We're talking about, right beneath Pennsylvania, over to southern Missouri, even St. Louis. It's another Mason-Dixon line. Over to Austin. You know what's unique about all three, from Baltimore to Louisville to St. Louis to Austin? That's what I call the cultural Mason-Dixon line. It's all German settlement. That's where the British South sort of like fades into the German and Irish immigration South. They didn't buy into the same cultural modes as the Anglo and Celtic, the Scots-Irish South. Okay, so I'm gonna give y'all a little cultural lesson. Y'all need to know some things. Southern culture is founded upon a very British patrician way of looking and organizing society in the world. An imperialistic vision that they got from the Romans before them. The Scots-Irish, their neighbors for centuries, come in, and the Scotsmen come in, and they bring in the other South that you are familiar from stereotypes. The rough and tumble white Southern who lives in the backwoods. These are the same people who lived in the back country in the British Isles. So you have those two cultures. British urban, British rural, and Celtic rural. And then you have Germanic Southerners who kind of fade in the background. And they go to Appalachia, they go to the Blue Ridge, they go to the Upper South. And then there's this German migration that Hasia speaks of, that German-esque Jews were a part of, following other Germans who were not Jewish. And they come into Baltimore and Louisville and St. Louis and Austin. All cities which are, Austin is very south by southwest. And St. Louis and Louisville are very south by Midwest. And Baltimore has always been very south by Northeast. But there's a reason for that. It has nothing to do with regionalism. It's nothing to do with the fact that those immigrants really did not buy into the same vision. The Southerners who came before them who were Jewish were in Charleston and Savannah, which at one point, right, had more Jews in Charleston and Savannah than did in New York. Y'all came late. But even to this day, if you talk to, if I meet an African-American person who has a Jewish last name, I can peg them real quick. I'm like, okay, your people came from Charleston, Savannah, or New Orleans. And how did you know? I said, because you're either part Sephardic or people who held your family in bondage was Sephardic. And say, yeah, you have no idea how many Levies and Cohens you will find on the Free People color registries in these cities. You have no idea how many African Americans will say things like, yeah, we came from Charleston, Savannah, but my grandmother said we don't put pork or shellfish in our pots. That's not for us to eat. People ignore the fact that there are not just Jews of African descent in Ethiopia. We're spread throughout West Africa. There are so many routes into this story. William Simons, who was buried in the cemetery, the synagogue in Charleston, the old synagogue. There were black people who were sort of members of these synagogues in the South. And they had been, before them, there were Africans, enslaved, not enslaved, who were members of synagogues in Europe. So the drama had already started with the Spanish, Portuguese, and the presence of color. There were black people in those synagogues in medieval and Renaissance Europe. You never heard about that. But it's right in front of your face. I'm going to say one thing, we'll jump to the food. So you go in, so Walter's Art Gallery had a beautiful painting called The Ghetto of Elizabeth. And it was an exhibit about Africans and in Renaissance Europe. And it was there because, side by side, you see the Jewish community living side by side the black community living at the same exact time. You mean to tell me in all that time that they never mixed food culture? The Portuguese were the inventors of the slave trade. And remember what the Jews had to do with run around the globe to escape the Inquisition. So this collision of, the so-called, we're not antipodes, we're kissing cousins. Everywhere the Jewish diaspora has been, the African diaspora has been, often at the same time. So it makes complete sense that in Cape Verde, in Congo, in these places that seed plantation culture in the Americas, and the interplay between African, European, and other cultures in the Americas mixed together. Another part of this is that you have to understand, so that the sort of like conflict between being Jewish, or Jewish people as an ethnicity, as a religion, as peoplehood, and Southern people is very recent. Dr. Diner said, don't the laws of Moses, to this day, most Southern evangelical Christians do not read Jews as anything more than the people of the Bible. You are frozen into this sort of Old Testament identity. That's who you are. And for the most part, it's like, wow, that's very nice. We have these Old Testament people sitting in our midst. That's great, because that's the old religion. That's what they believed. For African Americans, we were the glue in terms of the food. We may not have always invented the food, but we were the preparers of that food. Not just the plantations. Plantations had to be very wealthy. We're talking about the small farms of the South. 1/4 of all Southern whites held enslaved people in bondage. And not just that, but the taverns, the inns. Think about this. There were no such thing as restaurants. Even in the South, a restaurant as an institution really did not come about on its own until the late 19th century. Because pretty much you go to somebody's house, like a Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, and you can sit there for weeks on end. Who's making the food? Black people. And not just black people who just know how to cook, who were taught by some white woman. That's a total myth. You know, great-great-grandma may have learned alongside of white women, but ever since then, black women took over. And they're mixing African, European, and Native traditions in those southern kitchens together. And some of the hallmarks of that are one pot cooking, but everybody has one pot cooking, but the way they did it was unique because you're talking about traditional West African pattern of a sauce and a starch. Jambalaya, sauce and a starch. Gumbo, sauce and a starch. You know, chicken with gravy and biscuits, sauce and a starch. You know where I'm going with this? Or stew or soup. Deep frying the food, which, you know, to northern people, we deep fry everything. That's the Scots. Get it right. You have to cross the Atlantic for that. But that's special food. That's actually that's not an everyday food, traditional Southern food ways.
Michael?
Yes.
I also want you to talk a little bit about how these very unique dishes, which often contain, how African Americans had come up with these incredible ways of kosherizing, which ingredients that were very blatantly trade. These incredible inventions.
So I'll keep that separate from my own thing we'll talk about later. But I think what you're talking about right now is the black-eyed peas and kishka. I mean, but you know what? But you know what? It comes from. Well, let's talk about Mildred Covert real quick. Because Mildred Covert, blessed memory, snagged me when I was in New Orleans, and I knew her just from the cover of her book. She worked with one of her best friends. If you ever seen the kosher Creole cookbook, the kosher Cajun cookbook, the kosher Southern cookbook, it was Mildred Covert. So when I did this research tour to the South, I was the centerfold of Southern Jewish Life magazine. You're looking right at it. And it was weird. People were just like, oh my God, you're a naturalist. Let's set it. Look, Mr. Twitty, come on, come to my synagogue, come do something. And she wrote me an email from a former Hebrew school student. And she said, Mr. Twitty, you will be meeting with me when you come to my city of New Orleans, Louisiana. Be prepared. Signed, Mildred Covert. So they got to the hotel, the door swings open, she says, get in. And I got in, she's wearing this leopard print blouse. And she said to me, I brought you here for a reason. I wanted you to see where I grew up. And I wanted to tell you, who do you think we learned to cook from down on Dryad Street? She said, we learned, these are her exact words, we learned how to become American through the cooking of the black women we were neighbors to that worked with us. They translated America for us. So her mother gets off the boat from Galicia and she says that her mother had never seen a tomato before and thought it had blood in it. And she bought a bunch of bananas right there on the dock in New Orleans where all the bananas came through. And she tried to feed them to her children whole because she'd never seen them. And I just thought, well, this is amazing to get this memory from someone who's, you know, the first generation born American saw it. But even more so, she was like, yes, we saw this gumbo stuff. We were like, okay, wow, that's like chili. That makes total sense to us. But the food was a lot spicier, so we had to get used to it, that it was different. So the children grew up eating spicier food, tomato-based food. They grew up eating, you know, a lot more seafood. And I said to her, how did you do this? How did you grow up in the city, keep it kosher? And then you know, she said, well, my husband, first 5 years, he did not grow up keeping kosher, so I did a few things. But I make the best kosher stuff crab you ever had. So she grew up adapting with black women who were making the matzah meal fried chicken, who were making the herring and grits. These were all adaptations. But you know something, one last thing I need to say is that you need to understand in the black community, these same things were already going on. There were people who had different dietary issues and religious restrictions going back to the time of slavery. That 1/5 of the black population in the South, colonial South, was Muslim. 1/5. Which means 1/5 of the people are looking at pork and other things and going, we don't do that. And so you see in Texas and other places where people predominated the difference in what kind of barbecue in Kentucky, lamb and mutton versus, that's because they all came from Chesapeake. They were all Muslim, from synagogue. So all these connections go off in your head. But this is how Southern Jews kind of made this thing in their own households, but also to their neighbors. What you ate was very important. Number one, your neighbors want to know a couple things about you. Do you go to church? Not church like in Father, Son, and the End. Church as in a house of worship. Are you religious? 2, what does your mama make for dinner? These are important questions. And 3, can you make biscuits? If a Jew could answer, I go to synagogue, I can make biscuits, and my mother makes grits. Yes, we do have this. We do have that. Then it was all good. And that's how they made social negotiations between themselves and non-Jews. Not to say that there weren't significant cultural issues, religious issues, people being excluded from clubs and schools. There was all of that. But it wasn't quite as Mississippi burning as people make it out to be from that colonial through pre-civil rights period. And food was a great way to glue the peoples together.
And establish your identity, definitely.
Right.
I mean, you might have grits with herring, I've seen recipes for, and so on. So we know that Jews love African American cooking. And actually, Ted, I think you wrote that when African Americans migrated to the north after the First World War, they continued eating Jewish food. And that this was food that they had encountered either as neighbors to Jewish people, working for Jewish people, and often as caterers, because there is a significant, actually, and very distinctive Jewish African-American catering style that developed in Atlanta that incorporates lots of soul food. So we know about the Jewish love of African-American food. Tell us about African-American love of deli.
But first, I just want to say, Jayne, I mean, I'm just so happy to be here. And, you know, I'm such a fan of your work. And so Jayne and Hasia and Mike are all people who I brought to speak at my things in college. And I'm just meeting Robin and Kat for the first time now. So you can expect invitations. But I'm such a fan of all of your work. And I'm just so happy to be included here. And how often can you be on a panel and be watching sailboats going by? But you know what, I taught a course at Dickinson for about 8 years, a summer school course on food and foodways in the U.S. And the way we started the course every summer was by asking the question, is there an American cuisine? And we looked at all different ways of answering that question. And most of the scholars who have written about it have said, well, there isn't really an American cuisine in the way that there's a French cuisine or a Italian cuisine or so on, but that perhaps American cookery is characterized by its regionalism. And we have really a collection of different regional cuisines in our country. Or perhaps American gastronomy, so to speak, is characterized by the fact that we're a nation of immigrants. And so it's really just a conglomeration of immigrant cuisine. So what's interesting here is that this whole idea of Southern Jewish cooking is kind of a combination of those two ways of conceptualizing of American cuisine in general. But I just want to say my book that I published last year is really about the New York Jewish deli and the ways in which the the deli really spread throughout the country. So I have a little bit of information in that book on the delis of the South. And my object in that book is really to see the delicatessen not so much, or not, let's say, exclusively in terms of its food, but really the deli as a gathering place for the Jewish community. So Michael, when you said about the glue that really holds people together, I mean, I'm looking at things almost in a more sociological way, I would say, than a culinary way. And really trying to see how the delicatessen became almost like a surrogate or a substitute synagogue in many ways for Jews throughout the country. And there definitely were delis that opened up in the South. And there were delis in Charleston, there were delis in Savannah, and in New Orleans, and Memphis, and Jackson. All these places had delicatessens. Some were kosher, or some at least started out kosher. Some were very much not kosher. And just as we've been saying, that Southern Jewish food seems from the outset to have incorporated a lot of what we would call very treif ingredients, like certainly pork and shellfish and so on. And that eating those foods really was a part of Jewish identity in a way, right? I mean, but it was the context, again, it was the context in which the food that it was served, even more than it was what you were eating. If you were eating ham, right, at a Jewish holiday gathering, like ham for Hanukkah or something, ham for Hanukkah, I like that, then it was a Jewish dinner, right? I mean, it really was. And if you were eating, you know, shrimp and crawfish and lobster, but it was in a Jewish restaurant, then you were really, you know, and you were there with other Jews. I mean, in the same way that in New York, all of these non-kosher or kosher-style delicatessens developed, in which Jews were eating Reuben sandwiches and all kinds of treif foods, but they were doing it in an atmosphere that was a Jewish atmosphere, right? And in which they were in many ways concretizing their Jewish identity through being together with other Jews and sharing bread with them, or being companions, as you said, with other Jews.
But you mentioned how actually corned beef and other deli had a more universal appeal, and that people who had acquired a taste for it in the South, for example, including African Americans.
Yes, no, that's absolutely true. I mean, actually, my favorite story, one of my favorite stories from my book is, you remember Harry Golden, who wrote For 2 Cents Plain and other humorous books? He was a New Yorker who moved to North Carolina to take over the editorship of the North Carolina Israelite, which was the Jewish newspaper there. And he has a wonderful story about a delicatessen in Charlotte. I don't think a lot about Charlotte these days, but the Brass Rail in Charlotte, where he talks about on Sundays, he says, after church, he said he saw wave after wave of Israelites crossing Church Street like they were crossing the Red Sea for the stuffed cabbage, the flank, and the chicken in a pot. And it wasn't just the Jews, right? He says the church bells were pealing at noon, and you know, he says that, you know, the song was playing, we're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion, and people are pouring across Church Street to Izzy and Jack, who are already slicing the hot pastrami. So yeah, I mean, then as you mentioned, you know, both Jews and non-Jews really became very enamored of these kinds of foods. And when African Americans started to move to the north, I think my sense is that in many cities and in many places, African American customers were more welcome in Jewish-owned restaurants as a whole than in many other kinds of white-owned restaurants. That was not universally true by any means. There was an infamous delicatessen in Atlanta called Lev's, which you might have heard of, which the owner, Charlie Lebanon, was a really fierce supporter of segregation. He actually refused Harry Belafonte a seat in the restaurant when he came down. And there was a sit-in that was staged in his restaurant in the early 60s, and he actually walked out. He locked the bathrooms, which the place ended up being a mess. He locked the bathrooms and just walked out, and he ended up, you know, really becoming reviled by that community. But even in other places, I mean, Baltimore, where I live now, there was a delicatessen that advertised, it was a kosher deli, advertised in the 1920s, I think it was, that they were very willing to serve black patrons as long as the African American customers brought their own plates to the restaurant, right? So there were definitely exceptions to this, but there were lots and lots of places, I mean, particularly in Chicago, where there was a large influx of African Americans from the South, obviously, where there was a delicatessen on Maxwell Street, which was like the Lower East Side of Chicago, you know, the immigrant ghetto of Chicago, where a deli owner named Ben Lyons actually ended up, when he retired, turning over his delicatessen to one of his African American countermen named Nate Duncan. And this guy, Nate Duncan, ended up running the deli, even as the neighborhood really transitioned from an African American from a Jewish neighborhood to an African American neighborhood. If you've ever seen the movie The Blues Brothers, right? There's a great scene that's actually set in that deli. They call it the Soul Food Cafe. Aretha Franklin does this big production number in the Imagine, I think it is, in there, and you can see the interior of it. And they even left the sign outside, you know, sort of by mistake, sort of not, so that you know that's what it is. But I did write an article about this recently about in Baltimore. There's a deli in Owens Mills, which is right near where I live in Maryland, called Miller's. And the wait staff and the counter people, everyone there is owned by a Jewish family, but the employees are all African American, and the menu is half pastrami and corned beef and half fried chicken and macaroni and cheese. I've never seen this before anywhere else, but I'm wondering if maybe this is sort of the new trend that in places.
That's cool.
Maybe it's not the new trend. All right, so I'm already behind the time.
Okay, so really, what's corned beef but brisket plus pickling?
The pickling, right? And pastrami is then smoked and spiced. That's
Right.
That's right. And then, but in the South nowadays, I mean, something that we talked about earlier is that the big thing in the South nowadays, and in New York too, actually, in terms of brisket and beef and so on, is barbecue, right? I mean, barbecue is such a big tradition in the South, particularly in places like Memphis. And there has been for decades, I don't know if you've heard about this, there's this huge barbecue, he's smiling, do you know about this? The big barbecue contest, they have the World Championship barbecue competition every year.
I think they just had it September 18th.
I think they just had it. Actually, it's spread all over the place.
Memphis in May.
Memphis in May. Oh, that's right, Memphis in May. Thank you. And they have, what? They have thousands and thousands. They have like 27 states that are represented. People come from different countries. And they all, they have the whole hog contest. And they have the pork shoulder contest and so on. So about I think 27 years ago, an Orthodox congregation in Memphis called Anshe Sfard Bethel Emet, right, ASB, started a Jewish, a kosher takeoff kind of thing on the barbecue contest. And so now they have, I think, 40 teams and 300 people, 3,000 people, and they have these all over the place. The one in Atlanta is actually happening right now as we speak. It's today, between I think 11 and 3. So if you run to the airport, you might still make it.
Well, I love the one in Memphis because they have such a great sense of humor. They used to have a prize for the best breast. And that was sponsored by the Plastic Surgery Group of Memphis. and they have great names for their teams, like Grillin' to Fillin'.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. But nowadays, there's so much great barbecue in New York, and there's even kosher barbecue, right? I mean, there are places. I have a friend named Joe Godin who has a kosher barbecue place in Teaneck. And now I think in some ways a barbecue joint is sort of replacing the delicatessen in some ways.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
So that incredible aroma, that perfume of barbecue, is as much a signifier of Southern cuisine as fried chicken, right? But usually whether chopped or ribs, North Carolina style or Memphis made, barbecue in the South means not brisket, but pork. And many Jews in the South embrace pork barbecue, including, even as Marcy Cohen Ferris has said, having pork barbecue along with challah at a Shabbat dinner. And roast pork, well, I think to explore that, we'll take a trip to Natchez. And Robin, tell us about Natchez, where your family goes back how many years, and what was Natchez like?
Sure, so thank you for having me, and for a little bit of context, yes. So I was raised in the Washington, D.C. area, where my parents were actually here today, which I'm very excited about. But my mother, Mildred, who's in the audience today, grew up in the small town of Natchez, Mississippi, which, for those of you who are not familiar with Natchez, is a town of about 16,000 people that sits right on the Mississippi River. It's about 160 miles north of New Orleans, And our family, which was originally the Ullman family, has lived in Natchez since 1850 when we immigrated to the US through the port of New Orleans from Le Havre, France. So I feel like I've heard the other panelists today in one way or another really describe my own family's history. We were peddlers initially, we then opened a general store in Natchez that ultimately, under my grandparents' tenure, became a very upscale department store in the way that like a Goldblatt's would have been in Chicago, with a men's department and a ladies department and a bridal section and things. But because my family has been in Natchez for so long, we were, like many Jews, they're very assimilated. So Natchez, at one point, had hundreds of Jewish families, so many that the synagogue that my family still attends was built in 1905 to allow, hundreds of worshipers to attend services there. It's a beautiful neoclassical building with stained glass windows and Grecian columns out front. Unfortunately, in Natchez today, there are literally like 5 or 6 Jews left in the town, one of whom is my 98-year-old grandmother, Elaine, who still lives there. My grandfather, Robert, passed away in March at age 99, just a couple months short of his 100th birthday. But that community, which was once very, very robust, is dwindling, and a lot of the reporting that I've done in my own family, because I'm a reporter, an investigative reporter actually by trade, has been about kind of what is going to happen to Natchez and to that culture once the actual people who've been the custodians of that culture are no longer there. So that's all for context. Yeah, so we have, so by way of example, so in 1994, Natchez held what they called a Jewish homecoming, so that all of the people who had Jewish roots in Natchez could return because so many of them had left. And my grandmother, along with Marcy Cohen-Ferris, the scholar from UNC, whose name has been invoked a couple times today, were two of the people who helped plan this gathering. Marcy at the time worked for the Institute for Southern Jewish Life, which is based in Jackson, Mississippi, and is one of these groups that really helps keep the embers alive of Judaism in the South. And there was this big negotiation over what kind of food they were going to serve at the reception for this event. And my grandmother drew a menu, and being the proper Southern socialite hostess that she was, the menu included shrimp mousse and ham biscuits, which, if you're not familiar, is a beautiful, flaky, delicate biscuit with thinly sliced shaved ham in the middle. And Marcy was horrified when she saw this item on the menu, and according to Marcy, said something to my grandmother like, there are going to be New York rabbis at this event, including the head of the Reformed Jewish movement in America. And she was like, we can't serve this. It's going to be so appalling to Jews coming from other parts of the country who are not used to Southern traditions. And my grandmother was like, no, are you kidding me? I'm not going to have a table in Natchez. Like, this is not, I believe she said, this is not a New York Jewish homecoming, this is a Natchez Jewish homecoming, and in Natchez, we serve ham biscuits, and literally, what are you gonna serve in the biscuit if you aren't gonna put ham in it? You can't serve the biscuit plain, I mean, duh, this is just so obvious to her. And I was 12 years old in 1994, and so I did attend this event, and but I had to go back to people like Marcy when I was reporting this story to be reminded how this all played out. And I also spoke to a woman named Mimi Miller, who is the head of the Natchez Historical Society and a close friend of my grandparents. And there was just this crisis because, you did not tell Elaine Lehman, who was the social arbiter of Natchez, how to serve food at a reception for hundreds of people. That was, she knew. But at the same time, they were trying to, navigate this territory of being Southern, but also being Jewish, and what that meant, and what that looked like, and how these foods were representative of those dual identities, to which in my grandmother's mind, there was no conflict. You're Southern, you're Jewish, you serve ham biscuits, it's no big deal. And it was really only to outsiders who didn't understand the particular sort of assimilated culture of Jews in Natchez. It was only a big deal to them. So the resolution of this story was that apparently there was an intern at the time whose name was Kenneth. I've never met Kenneth, but if he's out there, I'd like to meet him someday, who said to my grandmother, you know, Ms. Lehman, I know, like, these New Yorkers, they just don't understand, but here's the thing about us Southerners, we don't like to offend. And immediately she was like, oh, Kenneth, you're right. We don't like to offend. And so, like, a compromise was reached by which, like, they did serve the ham biscuits, but they served them, like, over there on the side, and there were also plain biscuits. When I talked to Mimi Miller about this, I think she put it really well that, you know, Natchez was such a small community that after about 1970, we didn't even have a full-time rabbi anymore. We had a traveling rabbi who would come to town every couple of weeks or sometimes every couple of months. And I think there was a sense of pride of, like, we sustained Jewish life on our own for centuries without the help of these institutions, and, like, we can do this just fine, thank you, and we're gonna do it our way. And there was no conflict in the minds of people like my grandmother, like, we're Southern, we're Jewish, and this is how we express that identity.
And as a matter of fact, it wasn't just the Lehman family, but even the, I think, the president of the synagogue, of the temple, right, who has, tell us about Miss Naomi and the things that she makes.
Sure, so Jayne is referring to a man named Jay Lehman, no relation to our family, the Lehmans, who still lives in Natchez. His family, he actually runs a dry goods business, like a wholesale food business that his family has had for generations and generations. Jay Lehman's mother was Miss Naomi, and she was a renowned cook in Natchez. And the way that the Lehman family celebrated Break the Fast for Yom Kippur every year was with Miss Naomi's famous pork roast. So they would fast.
And they fasted, right?
They would fast. And then they would break the fast with pork roast with pork cracklings on top. And I had never heard of that anywhere before. But again, there was just no conflict for them. This was how they celebrated the holidays. Miss Naomi also made, for Passover, matzo balls with turkey gravy, which is an interesting adaptation. And I believe when the synagogue does their annual Passover Seder, which they still do, they also serve matzo balls with turkey gravy.
Sounds delicious, actually. So from Natchez, it's just a short trip to New Orleans. Kat, this is an area that you've been exploring a lot. Tell us, because New Orleans, I mean, obviously everybody knows it's not just a great food city for non-Jews, but even for Jews who keep kosher as well. And it's had an incredible mix of collaborators on that cuisine, from the early Jewish immigrants to other ethnic varieties who had contributed to the cuisine as well. So tell us about that, some of the early influences and ingredients and techniques that they introduced.
So thanks for having me here today. So I come from Montreal, and I have a pop-up dinner business called Long Chew, and we explore lesser-known Jewish communities at these dinners. So my business partner and I decided to, after our first year, to take a research trip down to New Orleans because we had never visited. It seemed like a great city, and what we discovered was just a really, really interesting Jewish community. There's about 9,000 Jews in New Orleans. There was about 13,000 before Katrina. And so just for a little bit of historical context, the first synagogue that opened up in New Orleans opened in 1827. And it was Jacob Solis helped to found it. When he got to the city, he was kind of appalled at the fact that he had trouble finding matzah. And so he wanted to try to organize the community a little more. One of the first larger immigration of Jews to New Orleans, they were Jews from Alsace-Lorraine, as you mentioned earlier. And so they were bringing with them the cuisine from this region. but they were also, they wanted to adapt and become part of white Creole society at the time. So in their kitchens, not only were they making cabbage and potatoes and meat, but then they were also eating shrimp and pork and a lot of all this trafe stuff, or foods rather. This kind of so this cuisine, they were eating this. This is primarily the Jewish cuisine that was being cooked and eaten in New Orleans up until about 1850, which when you had a larger you had Eastern European immigrants coming to the city, and it was at that point that they introduced Eastern European food, and they were keeping kosher. So then you also had the opening of some stores and some smaller Jewish delis at the time as well. One of these delis that opened up later on in the 30s was the Pressner Deli, and I spoke to the owner of that deli, and Jackie Pressner and her family opened this deli, and they were serving brisket and gefilte fish and pickles, and she remembers going out with and when she was in university, finding the people from the Northeast who were missing home, and they would go out, and then they would all come back to the deli, and her mom would hear them come open up and then serve them pickles and smoked brisket, and so then you had that influence in the cuisine of Jewish cuisine in New Orleans. So now today you actually do have a kosher deli in New Orleans called Kosher Cajun. Sorry? New York kosher? I just thought it was Kosher Cajun.
And you also have, as Michael had mentioned, I think you also met Mildred Colbert,
yeah,
right?
I met Mildred, right. So, sorry, yeah. So she was, what Mildred did, she was, I think you mentioned, born in 1927, and her family came from Poland. And so she grew up in a traditional home, and she kept kosher. And when she married her husband in 1949, like, as you mentioned, he didn't grow up in an observant family and wasn't keeping kosher. And there were a few years where they didn't have a kosher home. But then, because of this kind of funny incident where she tried to cook red beans and rice for her husband, she got this recipe from her mother-in-law. And so she went to the book. Her mother-in-law told her to get pickled pork, but she went to the butcher and got salt pork, and he gave her this very small piece. And she was like, no, I need a bigger piece of meat to serve to my husband. So like, this is ridiculous. So he gives her a big piece of salted pork, and she goes back home, makes red beans and rice, puts this big piece of salt pork in it, and lets it stew. And then by the time she serves it to her husband, it's just completely inedible because it's so salty. And it was after that moment she decided that they were going to be keeping a kosher home, and she wasn't going to try to cook pork anymore. And so she started, because her husband, was Southern as well, and was used to eating all these traditional Southern dishes, that she was going to make them kosher. And so in doing so, she ended up creating a Southern kosher cuisine, and she. She did things. There was this one dish which I actually served to NYU students when they came to visit New Orleans in March, but it was oysters Rockefeller. And so and when she actually made it, she took an oyster shell, because she told me, well, there's nothing, the shells are not, it's fine, you can just put stuff on the shells, they're okay. It's just the oyster itself that's not kosher, but so they took oyster shells and then put a piece of gefilte fish on the shell with the oyster Rockefeller sauce on top, and she baked them. So you have these really amazing creative ways of taking these very traditional Southern dishes and making them kosher. And so she ended up writing very important cookbooks that basically codified Southern Jewish cuisine and made them not only available to the community in the South, but then to the larger Jewish community as well.
like the matzo balls, I found really fascinating in your podcast, all the different things that they did with matzo balls. The creole seasoning,
Yeah.
putting them in a gumbo,
Yeah.
and topped off with creole matzo balls.
Exactly.
And if I may interject, what makes, it's really a clash between African, West African and Gallic, food combinations. But what do you call it in New Orleans when you put together the green pepper, the green onion,
Holy
and the
Trinity.
garlic? It's called the Holy Trinity.
So,
Yeah.
so she had all these issues, and she was also writing for the Times-Picayune in New Orleans, and so.
For a general audience, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
so she was introducing this Southern kosher cuisine to this also more general audience in the city, which was really advantage.
And there's also, I found, you mentioned with beverages, there's also a Jewish connection with two New Orleans favorites, Café du Monde and I think Breaking the Fast with.
Right, well, I'll speak on Café du Monde, so I don't know if whoever's been to New Orleans, you've probably been to Café du Monde. They make beignets and they serve chicory coffee. It's really, really delicious. And it's actually kosher. And it became kosher, it got certification in 2008. And the rabbi that decided to help Café du Monde become certified did this because he wanted to, this was, after Katrina, and he wanted to help the Jewish community be able to really experience New Orleans cuisine and really, also feel like they were really part of the city and the culture and the food culture. And so, so he decided to certify Café du Monde because it's this iconic New Orleans restaurant. And so for observant Jews to be able to go there and experience what people in New Orleans are experiencing, visitors are experiencing, was he saw this as a way to really make them for a way to really allow them to integrate into New Orleans.
Yeah, and the beignets as well. I think the Coke connection is, those of you who are familiar with Streetcar Named Desire, remember those Cokes with, lemon Cokes with chipped ice, and Coca-Cola is to really refresh you when you're incredibly hot. So Yom Kippur, as you can imagine, before air conditioning, was really a time of intense sweating. And in an Orthodox synagogue, I think maybe it was Beth Israel, there was a grocer who would wait for right after the shofar was blown on Yom Kippur and have hundreds of chilled Cokes for people to come out and break their fast with. Now, I want to, let me just see how much time we have. Okay. I want to leave you hungry, so I want to talk a little bit about contemporary Jewish food now. One of the things that we see in New Orleans is this fabulous restaurant, which is Shaya, which won the 2016 James Beard Award for Best Restaurant in the U.S. And Alan Shaya has been wowing New Orleans with his food, not only at Shaya, but at Domenica as well. So I want Kat, you to speak about that, and then Michael will get to you.
Yeah, so I had the pleasure of meeting Alon on the first trip I took down to New Orleans. And we met him at that time at Domenica, a restaurant that he was, I think, co-owner with John Besh. And even, so this was before he opened Shaya, but even at Domenica, he was bringing in these, his Israeli influences into this Italian restaurant, because his family is from Israel. And so one of the dishes you see this in is that, was a whipped tahini with a lamb bolognese and satay on it as well. It was amazing. And shakshuka with like local vegetables. So he was marrying the Israeli food that he grew up eating with local New Orleans ingredients. And so then he went on to open Shaya, which is an amazing, amazing restaurant. You should all go when you're down there. I had one of the best meals of my life there, and so he's also introducing the larger New Orleanians to Jewish food, right, through serving them Israeli food. So it's one portion of Jewish food, but nonetheless, it's kind of what Mildred was doing through her cookbooks and through her articles. He's now doing at the restaurant.
Right, and it's not only the everyday food, but he also does Passovers there.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I had read about Domenico was that among the guests that he has, Jewish and non-Jewish, there is a coterie of priests who come to Passover Seders there because they're so interested in what that food is like. No, it isn't kosher, but there are a lot of very vegetable-driven dishes. There's one incredible cabbage dish, a roasted cabbage. It's oven roasted and served with a muhamar. It's really
And the pita is fabulous.
Yeah,
Best pita of my life.
And Michael, I wanted to turn to you because you're not just a food historian of African American and Jewish food. You're also the embodiment of what you call identity cooking, meaning expressing our complex identities through how we eat. And in your case, as a Jewish African American, being kosher soul is about melding the histories and the flavors of being both Jewish and Black. And I think exploring this has been not only professional, but a very personal journey for you. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about that. And also, I think our audience will find 2 of your recipes printed in the program. But I'd like you to tell us a little bit about your Afro-Ashkefardi dishes that you have actually created.
So, my family, I have 2 tracks. One is sort of what I call the antebellum chef, and I actually go to Southern plantations, and I used to go to Tarrytown and Phillipsburg Manor. I should say any place where enslaved people cooked. And I actually wear the clothes and cook the food. Now the first question is always, was it kosher? And the answer is no, because no such thing existed. There's only one place I've ever found that would have applied to, and that was the Moses Myers household in Norfolk, Virginia. We know he was a slaveholder in the Chesapeake region who kept kosher because he only ordered shellfish and pork for his enslaved workforce. So his cook and her family were fully aware of the laws of kashrut, fully aware. So for generations, there was this negotiation of white and Black people, Jews and not Jews, wherever they fit on the spectrum, figuring out recipes that were Southern and they were kosher. And for most people, they go, oh, it's just a pork thing. It's not, that's a simplistic view of Southern cooking. Because there are vegan Southerners and vegetarian Southerners, and have been so for quite some time. And a minority, they've always been there. So people have always tried to negotiate in and out of that. The pork thing was not the biggest thing. For African Americans, also the health issue and the influence of, Malcolm X, Nation of Islam. People stopped eating pork. Black power stopped eating pork. What did they do? They moved to smoked turkey. They moved back to smoked fish, which was our original, umami ingredient from West Africa. You talk to West Africans, they do smoked fish, they do smoked shellfish, they don't do smoked pork. So we did smoked turkey and smoked fish. We moved back to that. So for me, kosher soul is about, people looking at Black and Jewish. Big surprise, Moses was, get out of here. But since you have an issue with me, I'll just sit you down to my table and you can eat and figure out who I am. And while you're chewing and not talking, and God is helping you think, you may just understand what this means. So, in my suburban, synagogues in the Washington, D.C. area, I've been privileged to teach kids who were Ashkenazi, who were Sephardi, who were Asian, who were Latino, who were Native American, who were Black, and Indian subcontinent. And I have the obligation to sort of look at those kids and go, how do I help you feel completely whole as a Jew? And I use food and ask them to say, hey, we'll keep it kosher, but I want you to bring in all the elements of your identity into the classroom. And then when they did that, these students, 6th, 7th, 8th graders, when the self-esteem counts the most, they begin to talk and open up about the other parts of their identity and their heritage. And they have them research Jews in China, Jews in Japan, Jews in Latin America, and they would get these immense histories and go, see, we were always there. And it did wonders for them. So I do the same thing with food. So let's say you come to my house. And what's his name? Bizarre Foods. Andrew Zemany. He ate everything I made for him. I've never seen a human vacuum cleaner that clean my life. And on camera, I was for 5 minutes, but we were with each other for a couple of hours. And I made him kosher soul rolls. Because I said to him, well, what do Black people and Jewish people love the most? And I said, Chinese food, obviously. So I said, let's take pastrami and collard greens and put it in a spring roll. Put anything in a spring roll and make it work. And so it came from the fact that I went to North Carolina, they made this thing called soul rolls in Charlotte. They had collard greens in them. Then I went to Borough Park, one circus, and I was gonna buy a little love. I just wanted to go to Borough Park, I'd never been there before. Buy a little love, and I'm going to the community. And I walk into this one place, and he has egg rolls with pastrami. And I said, oh yeah. So I walk in, the okay, the to you too. And I buy them, and I said, okay, this could be better. It needs some hot sauce in it, some collard greens, and some other southern stuff has been perfect, so that's how we did that. But for me, it's not just the classic mixture that comes from that southern Jewish heritage, but also taking West African diaspora food, Jewish diaspora food. I come from a Sephardic congregation, Magen David, in Washington, D.C. The women who taught me Jewish food, other than Joan Nathan, who's a friend of mine, who I learned to make challah and other good stuff on, in her kitchen, those women taught me the Middle Eastern food of Levant, and Persia, and Syria, and Tunisia. And so it was so familiar because the spices are there. Moroccan food and Senegalese food are connected to each other historically. So that was all a part of it. And I learned how to watch the women's hands as they cook. Don't ever go in the kitchen, but a little bit of advice. When you do your own cultural anthropology, you and your own families, do not go in there thinking that you're going to be the Food Network's next personality. Go wash the dishes. These elders don't understand. Tell me everything you're doing and every single measurement. And tell me, where did you get the recipe from? No, wash the daggone dishes. And if you're going to take pictures, don't take pictures of the food. Take pictures of every movement of the hand because you know they're not using measurements. But it's how the hand is shaped that produces it. And then eventually you get to ask them questions like, so when did you marry so-and-so? Then also the food stories will emerge. And that's what I do. So I've been told I must make a plug, and I won't make a plug. So next year, the cooking gene is coming out with HarperCollins, my book. Tracy, it's not a cookbook, not yet. There will be a kosher soul cookbook, because I'm tired of asking for recipes. I go to synagogues and do these big dinners, and I'm like, you need a cookbook. I said, it will get there eventually. But the cooking gene is telling my family story, and also my personal story, Jayne Cohen story, from Africa to America, from slavery to freedom. And I will tell you one of the Jewish angle to this. When we sold this book, I had one, I can't tell you who it was. It wouldn't be very nice. It would be complete lush up our but Black gay Jews are not often do speak lush up our That's a total joke.
Very nice.
You know that's a total satire, like they said. But they said to me, you know what, this is a great idea. Talking about, history of Black food, and Southern food, and German, but just don't talk about being Jewish. And I said, why? I'm already coaching solo on Twitter, for God's sake. And they said to me, America's not ready for you yet. And I said to them, I'm a black dude in America. America's the only country where I'm possible. And I said, you know what, you can keep your whatever. I'll keep my keeper on my second Steve Diner. So, yeah, this food thing is very political. Don't get it twisted. It's always political wherever you go. It always brings up, both happiness and sadness, arguments and joy, just because, it's food. And we're Jews and we don't argue about food.
And so on that note, while we take questions, you'll be tasting 2 samples prepared that were inspired by the Southern Jewish Kitchen. As Sam mentioned, they are from Box, our plain Hindu cafe. The first is a Creole seasoned rip on Chef David's grandfather's savory matzah babka. The matzah babka is on the regular menu, and I can tell you it's really delicious. The second is a sweet pecan noodle kogo. And afterwards, you'll have a chance to schmooze with the panelists and with the other guests when our bars serve Box's craft cocktail of manischewitz and peach sangria and soft drinks. And just another note to remind you that books by Ted, Hasia, and me are available in the bookstore, and we urge you to buy them and bring them up to be autographed. Yes?
I know people talk about where you're from, but can you introduce everyone in the background?
Oh, I thought you all had the programs.
They're here, they're on the bar.
Yeah, okay, all right. Okay, let's start with you, Hasia.
Hi, I'm Hasia Diner, professor at NYU in Judaic Studies and History, and personally from Wisconsin, and East European immigrant parents, and very unusual generationally, that my parents were immigrants. And I've had 2 sort of scholarly food encounters. One was a book that came out in 2009, I think, or sometime in the first decade of the odds, called Hungry for America, Italian, Irish, and Jewish food with the Asian migration. And there's 3 different groups and how they negotiated American abundance. And then my Pendle book called Roads Taken. So I'm always obsessed with food. Try to figure out what I'm going to have for dinner tonight.
Michael?
Sure. My name is Michael Twitty. I'm a culinary historian. You can read my blog at afroculinary.com. And I'm an independent scholar of African American Jewish food waste.
Ted?
Ted Merwin. I teach religion and Judaic Studies at Dickinson College in Carlisle, PA. I am originally from Great Neck, where I grew up going to Italy. And I wrote a book called Pastrami on Rye, an overstuffed history of the Jewish deli. And I guess that's it. Oh, I write for the New York Jewish Week also. I wrote a culture column for the Jewish Week.
Robin?
My full name is Robin Amer. I live in Chicago. I'm originally from Washington, D.C., and as you already heard, my family is from Natchez, Mississippi. I'm an investigative reporter and editor by trade. By day, I'm the deputy editor of the Chicago Reader, which is our all-weekly newspaper. And I've also been developing a radio show with WNYC over the past year.
And Kat?
I'm Katherine Romanow. I'm from Montreal, and I'm the director of food programming at the Museum of Jewish Montreal. We just opened up a new space in the city, and I run the cafe there called Fletcher's. So if you're in Montreal, you should come eat at the cafe. And I also do food programming in the space. And I put together our Beyond the Bagel walking tour, so you get to explore Jewish history in Montreal on this walking tour, and you get to eat a lot as well. So yeah, I'm a Jewish food historian. I studied the Moroccan Jewish community in Montreal for my master's thesis, and I also do lots of pop-up dinners and cooking workshops with my other business called Revolution.
And I apologize, I thought you all had programs, and Any other questions? Yes. In the back. Yeah. Do we have a mic that we could? No. Oh. Could you come up here?
I wonder if there's a difference between the gala of the one country and the Jews of Savannah, Charleston, and how they're
So the question was, is there an interplay between the foodways of the Gullah Geechee people and Jews who were from Savannah, Charleston, and Low Country? Quick explanation, Gullah Geechee refers to a large community of African Americans who lived either on the Sea Islands or the coastline of the Carolinas and Georgia. And what makes that community unique was it was isolated because of the climate and the mosquitoes, which were infesting the rice fields, indigo fields, and Sea Island cotton fields that were there. The people who were brought to the Low Country from West Africa were able to preserve an enormous amount of the culture, not just in food, but in language and other areas, religion. And in many ways, it's the people of New Orleans, the black communities of New Orleans and the Low Country that are probably most African of all African American communities. The Low Country cuisine has become the signature spotlighted Southern cuisine in the past couple of years. Certainly with, Mike Lotta, Sean Brock, other chefs have been spotlighted for that. But you should know that there's not too many black chefs who have been highlighted in terms of being the makers of that cuisine. As far as Jews are concerned, absolutely. If you look at Marcia Cohen Ferris's book, Gefilte Gumbo, the chapters, she makes a point to go and focus on Charleston, Savannah, because unique things happen there. One of the quick answer would be that red rice is a great example. So red rice is what we call Mexican rice. It's really what happened when the Spanish brought black people from Senegal to Mexico, dropped them off, and made them grow rice. And they put tomatoes and peppers in the same way they did in Senegal. You see the same people to Brazil, and you see the same Brazilian rice. You see the same people to South Carolina, and you call it red rice. Same people to New Orleans, you call it jambalaya. But when Sephardic Jews show up, they have their own tomato rice, called pink rice. Anybody who comes from a Sephardic family, particularly from the Levant or from the Eastern Mediterranean, will know what I mean when I say pink rice. Basically, it's tomatoes and rice and onions and kind of a paella kind of deal.
Like and curly.
Yeah, exactly. So you can imagine when one community has pink rice, the other community has red rice, minus one or two ingredients, they're going to have a comparable eating place. So there's been a lot of influence there. And in fact, like Ted said, a lot of these African American cooks and chefs are writing these books. They're including recipes for cocoa and for pickling things and other stuff because they are used to cooking for Jewish audiences and clientele in those same communities.
I think if some of you are familiar with the Louis Armstrong signature to his letters, red beans and rice through yours, and one of the things that I found so fascinating about this cuisine was that in different areas of the South, the way people kosherized a dish like red beans and rice was different. I mean, in the Low Country area, they may have used hot dogs and sausage, whereas in New Orleans, they wound up using corned beef and something else that was smoked. So you have these really interesting regional substitutions as well. Any other questions? Yes?
Thank you all so much for coming today. Such a beautiful, important panel. I was born here. I was from North Carolina. I graduated from Mexico. I don't actually work for
Who's your girlfriend? She's great. A little geography. Yes.
I'm on the phone with her all the time. She's visiting all these communities. I guess we met that so I have some questions here for one of you real quick. One, you touched on a little bit about the interplay between the Jewish tradition and also the I know we can talk about collaborate on interaction. And also more contemporary sense, so many of my friends are really all vegetarian, and there's a lot of Jewish and not just sustainable and things that we used to talk about the view
In the South specifically?
in the South or Denver.
Well, would any of you like, I mean, I know that it's a very big movement also in terms of ethical Jewish eating. And for some, especially for some young people, the idea of eating kosher is also the idea of eating ethical. And that encompasses, in many instances, being vegan as well. And eating sustainable foods. Would anybody else?
I just want to say that there will be sort of nexus between sort of Jewish food life and vegetarianism goes back a long time, certainly a century or more, and that it's not the South, but on the Lower East Side, there was a Jewish vegetarian society, and there were vegetarian restaurants, and it was not just that they were vegetarian restaurants, but they actually had posters in the window and flyers condemning the eating of meat as a violation of the idea of, we shall not kill. And two scholars actually found a Jewish vegetarian cookbook from Vilna from the 19-teens. And so that there was a connection between, it was often a rejection of what they saw as the hypocrisy of rabbinic Judaism that put so much emphasis on meat, and where the idea that meat was really important, that a holiday had to be celebrated with meat. And it was this, again, I think it was very much a rejection of that, and the various vegetarians.
To bring it back to the South again, one of the things that many Jewish immigrants found in the South was this plethora of vegetables, many of which they were not familiar with, but there were so many new vegetables that they then incorporated into their cooking. Yes?
I would just like to mention the ubiquity of the celebrate. Mike Mills, who owns and runs a barbecue in Murfreesboro, Illinois, which is home of the Art Chef in Illinois, is yet. He's got a cookbook coming out. He's got a recipe. I guess next year he's got a recipe for soul rolls. He tells you how to make pastrami. How to grind it and smoke it and all that. And he's got a recipe for soul rolls. He's about as Southern Baptist as you can be, or East Baptist. He's got a recipe for soul rolls that he learned from somebody in Boston. So they're everywhere, thank God.
Yes, and let's just keep in mind that pastrami was a Romanian dish, okay, and then, Jews from Galicia, from Ukraine, from Lithuania would have come to America never having seen pastrami before, and they learned pastrami just a few blocks from here, or in the other equivalent neighborhoods, so that we should, be really careful about thinking about something called East European Jewish food. It was
really Turkish.
It's called Romania.
Pastrma.
Yeah, so Romania was, very much influenced by the Balkans and parts of the Ottoman Empire.
I do want to say that the pecan is actually at the bar, but we had another question. Yeah. I think we've discussed a lot about ways that Jews had devised kosherized recipes, and that would include using corned beef, using fish for a Creole fish dish, and so on. So there was definitely that, not only with work of Mildred Colbert, but in other areas throughout the South that we mentioned. Another thing that I'd like to bring up, and we didn't really get a chance to discuss this that much, is that I think in the South, Jewish identity is not as involved with what we think of as Jewish foods as it is in other areas of the country. One thing that I want to bring out is that Southern Jews do not consider themselves any less Jewish, as Robin was pointing out. And I think if you look at Jews in the South compared to other areas in the country, it turns out that Jews in the South are actually more affiliated. More Jews in the South go to synagogue, maybe on Friday nights, but than any other area in the country. So they have not defined themselves necessarily by rules of kashrut, but in certain terms of identifying themselves as Jewish, they definitely do so. And as
May I
we
jump
spoke of, and I do want to say one other thing, and we were talking about the Aspie barbecue contest, which is involves brisket, chicken wings, and so on. It is block kosher. Everything is incredibly supervised. The carts are kept in a separate area. They are only allowed to use ingredients that have been under kosher supervision. So, yeah, no, I think there is really a mixture here.
And whether or not, I mean, I think obviously if you're Orthodox Jew who keeps kosher now, you're coming from a different perspective than, say, my ancestors in the early 1900s, for whom getting access to kosher foods was actually quite a struggle. I mean, and again, Marcy Cohen-Ferris is sort of the patron saint of this panel. She's not here today, but she documented really well the struggles of getting, good brown bread, getting kosher meat, getting matzah. These were foods that were not always available to Jews in the South historically, and so people made compromises based on what was available to them. But I think also, I believe this is her who said this, that there's a degree to which, because we are a diasporic people, Jewish food is whatever Jews are eating, that we've all, to a certain extent, assimilated. I mean, I didn't grow up in a kosher household, despite not growing up in the South and perhaps having more access to Jewish foods. And this is my own sort of personal theory about this, but I think that there's a degree to which Jews as a minority in a place like the South probably felt a certain kind of pressure to assimilate and dispel with some of their otherness, in part by adopting the practices of their neighbors, and as Marcy likes to say, pork, shellfish, these are the elegant part of Southern cuisine. And how did my grandmother prove her southernness by serving ham? And it wasn't a negation to them, it was an adaptation. And without passing judgment on it, that's just the reality of how culture developed in the South.
Can I just add that, this is something I find really unfortunate, that it used to be that Jewish restaurants would be places where more observant and less observant Jews really could come together, including Deli. And I really wonder, for example, Kosher Cajun New York Deli in New Orleans, which is connected to the Young Israel community there in Metairie, whether or not that's mostly patronized by Orthodox Jews. I was actually just reading recently that the VOD of Washington, D.C. has been refusing to certify kosher restaurants in Washington because they're afraid of the potential of unmarried men and women socializing in those restaurants. So this is something that I think is really a big change, a big shift from the past, in which Orthodox Jews and less Orthodox Jews don't eat together.
And so, for me, okay, so we kind of walked around the biggest elephant in the room, the elephant of the power race in the South. Look, many a Southern Jew was able to survive by doing two things: using the N-word and not eating kosher. let's be real. Go and tell them the black folks go to the back door and eat their food there. In the same mouth, whispering,
Jews were bred as white.
I really,
White.
right. I really don't want to do this to you. But if I don't do this to you, they're going to burn my store down. The synagogue in Birmingham that I went to did a kosher soul meal out. I heard the most amazing stories, some of which, may not be. One was that the synagogue itself evaded being bombed when the rabbi said, I want to support Dr. King. African-American worker found the bomb. The leaders of the synagogue went to the police department and said, look, you know the difference. So here's the deal. We won't rat you out if you keep this from ever happening again. We don't want to be like Amer. The same people in that synagogue said, one woman said to me, I know that you all love Abraham Joshua Heschel, but to us he was not a hero. He scared us to death. Because when he marched across that bridge, we thought we were all going to get bombed and burned out. We thought that was over for us. So you have to understand, what my people went through in the South to adapt and become loved and appreciated. You have to do so many things, jump so many cultural hurdles. So there's that. But you also have people come to your presentations across this country and say, I grew up in the South in a small town in Mississippi, we kept kosher. I would love to talk to you. Because they're telling me they want to document that they lived in a small town in Arkansas, and they did it. And they had roads that didn't keep kosher. But guess what? In their household, somehow, some way, in the middle of nowhere, they did it. There are also people who say to me, you know what, this woman, she's passed away now, unfortunately. But I met her in that same synagogue in Alabama. And she said to me, my partner, she was lesbian, my partner and her mother were the cooks. And when my partner died of breast cancer, her mother and I got even closer. And I became the only person in her family. She converted to Judaism, Scots-Irish Southern. She converted conservative, and she said, I became the only person in the family to maintain all these recipes from Eastern Europe that my partner and her mother kept. So when the new generations of her family, born Jewish, come to want to know how to make the food, they come to me. Born in the Appalachian Hills of Alabama, Scotch-Irish, Presbyterian, now converted to Judaism for the tradition. And as a gay man, I think that's wonderful. So you get all these different paths, every little crisscross, and that's what makes us Amer.
I'm going to send you all to get drinks, but if any of you want to stay and ask questions, Mildred, you had a question.
Do you want the mic?
We can close on that note, but I would also like to say that in many households where there were African American cooks, sometimes it was the African American cooks who instructed the Jewish homemaker on kashrut. Thank you very much.